Some assembly required, and you mix the punch flavor.
Cops to Lego tow truck, come in tow truck, emergency on Sunnydale Bridge.
Fisher-Price Play Family House.
Remember those rich kid things from the 70s? The ones you didn't have, but never stopped wanting? Back then, these toys and gadgets weren't just cool. They marked who got invited, who got noticed, and who didn't. What did that leave behind in the kids who went without? Back in the 1970s, having an Atari Pong system was like owning the future. It was not just a toy. It was the kind of thing that made your house the coolest one on the block. Rich kids had them hooked up to their living room televisions like it was no big deal. You would walk in and see two little rectangles knocking a square dot back and forth across the screen. But that square dot? It was power. That console cost serious money, and if your family was not ready to drop the equivalent of a couple $100, you were not getting one. Watching the commercials was like torture. They showed families sitting together on shag carpet, laughing like everything was perfect, holding those twisty knob controllers like they had cracked the code on life. It was simple, it was clean, and it felt just out of reach. What made it sting more was that Pong was not flashy. It was just well made. And that made it feel even more exclusive. You knew the kid who had it. You remember standing by awkwardly while they let you play one round and then snatch the controller back. They always had the upper hand. That little blip of a ball? It was the sound of them winning, and you watching from the side. You could hear it before you saw it. That low rattle of gears and rubber on pavement. When a Raleigh chopper rolled by, every other bike might as well have disappeared. It had high-rise handlebars, a banana seat, and a frame that looked like it belonged in a motorcycle gang, not the school bike rack. And the kid riding it? Always a rich kid. Always. They would glide past you like they were in a magazine ad, not even pedaling half the time. That gear shifter in the middle of the frame looked like it was built for a race car. You had never even seen a gear shifter on a bike before. Yours probably came from the back of a hardware store. This thing looked imported from the future. And let us be honest, those bikes were not cheap. Parents who bought them were not just giving their kid a ride. They were buying attention, pride, and a neon-colored way to stand out. You tried not to care? You told yourself your bike got the job done. But deep down, watching them speed off with one hand on the bars and the other holding a can of soda, it burned. That chopper was not just a bicycle. It was a moving billboard that said, "My parents can afford it, yours cannot." It was the closest thing to magic you could hold in your hand. The Mattel Vertibird did not just sit still like the rest of your toys. It moved, spun, hovered. A tiny helicopter circling on a wire like it had a mission to complete, and only the rich kids were cleared for takeoff. If you were lucky enough to know someone who had one, you probably remember standing in their basement watching it spin around that plastic console like it was something out of a movie. The controls felt impossibly smooth. The noise it made was like a real chopper, kind of loud, kind of annoying, but somehow still beautiful. It came in all kinds of kits, rescue missions, police chases, even space ones. But no matter the model, it came with a price tag that said, "This is not for just anyone." These were not toys you saw in your average toy aisle. They were always sitting high up, behind glass, or in department stores your family did not shop in. You could not just ask for a Vertibird. It had to be gifted by someone with a solid bank account and a soft spot. It was the kind of toy that made other toys look boring. And when it took flight, so did your envy. And when you asked your parents if you could have one, they would give you that look, the one that quietly said, "Not this year." The Vertibird was not a toy, it was a symbol. If you had one, you were living different. If you did not, you just stood back and watched it fly circles around everything you owned. Now this one hurt the most because it was not even a toy. Not yet. The Star Wars Early Bird Certificate package came out before the actual action figures did. Rich kids got a fancy envelope in the mail with a promise inside. A cardboard stand, some stickers, and a little certificate saying their figures were coming soon. That was the flex. You were not just playing with Star Wars, you were ahead of it. And if you were not in the know, it made you feel like you missed a secret meeting. This was 1977, right after A New Hope changed everything and toys were flying off shelves. Except these toys, they were not even on shelves yet. You had to pre-order. You had to believe. And most families were not dropping extra money on toys that did not even exist yet. It was not just about owning the figures. It was about being part of the moment before the moment. These kids had the bragging rights of being first, even before anything arrived in the mail. That little cardboard stand on their dresser said, "We knew before you did." But the ones who did, their kids strutted into school holding that display stand like it was the Holy Grail. They knew something you did not. Their action figures showed up in the spring, 4 little plastic legends: Luke, Leia, Chewbacca, and R2-D2. And you just stood there, trying not to care. But it was obvious. They had it. You did not. And you would never forget it. Every time you saw it in a catalog, it looked like joy in a box. A bright red roof, that big white dog on top, and a little hand crank that promised a mountain of shaved ice on a hot summer day. The Snoopy snow cone machine was not just a toy, it was an event. And if you had it, you threw the kind of parties that kids remembered. It came with little paper cups, tiny flavor packets, and a scoop shaped like Snoopy's head. Everything about it screamed deluxe. But the truth? That thing barely worked. The crank was stiff, the ice melted fast, and the syrup ran out in 5 minutes. And still, everyone wanted it. It was sticky, messy, and almost always disappointing, and yet no one cared. The act of making the snow cone mattered more than eating it. The kid who had it was the one who got to stand behind the counter, smiling like a carnival vendor. You wanted it, because it meant your family could afford fun. It meant you had a kitchen big enough for a snow cone stand and parents who did not mind the mess. It was never about the taste. It was about showing off. The kid who had it only made snow cones a few times a year, but you would never forget watching them do it. You stood in line behind 6 other kids just to get a watered-down cherry slush in a cup half the size of your palm. But that did not matter. You were part of it for 5 minutes, and then it was over. It was the kind of thing that made you feel like you were in your own movie. The Sony Walkman, shiny, sleek, with its padded headphones and silver buttons, was a full-blown experience. Rich kids in the late 1970s had these strapped to their belts like they were carrying a portal to another world. Everyone else was stuck with boomboxes too big to carry or cassette players that needed 4D batteries. The Walkman changed everything. Suddenly, you could walk down the street with music just for you. You did not have to share it. You could press play, slide on those foam-covered headphones, and disappear. But only if your parents had the cash. These were not cheap. Getting one meant someone dropped real money to let you tune out the world. And that mattered. The kid with the Walkman had their own rhythm, their own world, and a volume knob that said, "I do not need to hear you right now." It turned ordinary walks into music videos, and for those without one, silence suddenly felt louder. The Walkman made you cool without saying a word. It turned bus rides, grocery store trips, and lonely afternoons into something cinematic. You felt behind if you did not have one. Like everyone else had the soundtrack to growing up, and you were just stuck in silence. There was a sound to it. That little jingle of the front springer fork, the hum of the rear slick tire, and the occasional squeak of the banana seat as a rich kid pedaled past like they owned the neighborhood. The Schwinn Stingray crate was not a bike, it was a ride. With its bright paint job, tall sissy bar, and gear shifter right in the middle, it looked like something out of a cartoon. And for most of us, that is where it stayed. In dreams, in comics, in the unreachable parts of toy catalogs. Those bikes cost money. Not the kind of money most parents could justify on a single-speed dream machine. But if your family had it, you showed up. That bike said you were living good. It said your parents wanted you to feel fast, strong, and cooler than any 10-year-old had the right to be. And we all noticed. They would ride it no hands, cruising past like they were floating. That sparkle in the paint job, that was not just sunlight, it was status. And you knew that even their bike got more compliments than anything you owned. You tried to act like your beat-up hand-me-down did the trick. But deep down, when that crate glided by, part of you wished just once it had been yours. These were not your little brother's bricks. The LEGO Expert Builder series, before it became Technic, was for the serious kids, the ones who had toolboxes, blueprints, and an attention span longer than 10 minutes. But here's the thing. These kits were expensive, and rich kids got them for birthdays or holidays with barely a blink. You saw them crack open the box, spread out all those tiny gears and rods, and start building like it was their job. The box said, ages 9 and up, but it might as well have said, you cannot afford this. It was more than just Lego. It was mechanical. Pistons, axles, moving parts. You could build a car and then actually steer it. For a lot of us, that was like holding an engine from the future. You could hear the click of gears and feel the snap of every piece sliding perfectly into place. These sets were not just about building. They were about control, precision, pride. And every time you saw one finished, you wondered what it felt like to be trusted with something so complex. Most kids never touched these. They were locked behind price tags and parent logic that said, you will lose the pieces. Maybe they were right. But it still stung when your friend came to school bragging about building a V8 engine out of Lego. You could spot them from across the school hallway, the shine, the cut, the label stitched loud and proud across the back pocket. Jordache and Sasson were not just jeans, they were declarations. They told you who had money, who had fashion, and who had parents that shopped at the kind of department stores that did not take coupons. These jeans were tight, flashy, and often came with matching jackets. They fit like they were made just for you, if you had a trust fund. Everyone else wore generic denim that sagged or bunched or looked like it had been handed down for 3 siblings. But the rich kids? They walked through the halls like they were on a runway. They had the attitude to match. If you had these jeans, people noticed, and if you did not, well, you noticed more. Because nothing makes you feel more like an outsider than standing next to someone who is wearing your parents' entire grocery budget just on their legs. It looked like a toy until it started playing. The Panasonic Take-and-Tape was a little portable cassette recorder that kids used to tape their voices, play their favorite songs, or pretend they were running a radio show. And it was not cheap. It came in bright colors, had a chunky handle, and most importantly, it worked. It felt professional. Rich kids would bring them to school to record class projects, or worse, just record nothing at all, just because they could. You wanted one, not because you needed it, but because it made sound feel personal. These were the first steps toward a world where kids could make things, songs, stories, messages, and hear them played back. It was powerful. If you had one, you felt like your voice mattered. If you did not, you just watched and wondered how it felt to press record and actually have something worth taping. Before smartwatches, before touchscreens, there was a time when telling time with glowing red numbers made you feel like you had stepped into the future. Digital LED watches were sleek, sharp, and expensive. They lit up with a single button press. No ticking, no hands, just pure digital magic. Rich kids wore them like they were secret agents. They would check the time in class with a smug little tap, and that red glow would flash just long enough for everyone around them to notice. The rest of us had to deal with plastic analog watches or whatever our parents found at the drugstore. These LED watches cost real money. The early models were made of stainless steel, with brushed metal finishes that looked more like something your dad would wear to a business meeting. But if you were one of the lucky few who had one, you were immediately cooler. You were tech-savvy, you were sharp, and you were ahead of the curve. Even the act of telling time became a performance. Tap the button, glance, and lower your wrist like you had just launched a satellite. It was not really about knowing what time it was. It was about showing that you could. They were not the most famous toys of the 1970s, but they were some of the most advanced. Micronauts were these incredibly detailed, posable action figures with interchangeable parts and tiny accessories that made you feel like you were handling alien tech. They were made in Japan and imported to the United States, which meant 2 things. They were cool and they were not cheap. Rich kids had full collections: figures, vehicles, play sets. You could build and rebuild them into whatever you wanted, and they looked nothing like the chunky toys most kids had. These were lean, mechanical, sharp-edged. The joints clicked in a way that felt like engineering. Owning them felt grown up. For everyone else, Micronauts were something you saw in catalogs or behind the counter at fancy toy stores. You did not just stumble across them. You needed someone to drive you to the one place in town that sold them, and even then, you were probably just looking. The kid who had a full Micronaut set was not just lucky. They were living in a different league. These were not toys that got thrown in a bin. They were displayed, shown off, guarded like museum pieces. You did not ask to play with them. You asked to watch. If you had a basement big enough for one of these, you were already winning. Real slot car racing sets were more than just toys. They were infrastructure. You had to build the track, connect the wires, plug in the controllers, and then zoom. Little electric cars flew around the curves with a sound that made your heart race. Rich kids had the deluxe versions: multi-lane tracks, working lap counters, speed control, even bridges. And they were not just for kids. Dads joined in. It became a family thing. That is how you knew the whole house had money. Most of us made racetracks out of cardboard and sound effects with our mouths. But this was the real deal. And it took up space. If your parents let you take over the basement or spare room for a slot car track, that meant a lot. These sets were not cheap, and they were not small. You could not casually own one. It had to be a decision. The kind of decision that said, yes, we have time and money for entertainment. Watching those little cars zip around the track, hugging corners and flying off the rails if you hit the throttle too hard, it was pure adrenaline. You just hoped someone would let you hold the controller, even for one race. Before they became a full-blown craze in the 1980s, Cabbage Patch Kids started as something far more rare and far more expensive. The early prototypes were handmade, cloth dolls called Little People, created by a young artist named Xavier Roberts, and only the richest families got them. These were not mass-produced toys from the shelf. These were boutique, soft sculpture dolls you adopted, literally. They came with birth certificates, backstories, and price tags that made your parents scoff and walk away. But if someone in your class had one, it was a big deal. You did not just own a Cabbage Patch Kid. You were its parent. You cradled it, named it, introduced it to friends. And that level of attachment, it made the rest of us feel like we were missing something. Our dolls came from supermarket aisles and yard sales. Theirs came in fancy boxes with custom signatures. These early dolls were not toys. They were art. And when the craze exploded a few years later, those rich kids got to say, I had one before they were popular. Of course they did. They always did. It looked like something from a spaceship. The Polaroid SX70 was the first folding instant camera, and when you saw someone snap a photo and watch it develop in seconds, it felt like magic. Rich kids did not just take pictures, they made memories on demand. You had to pay for the camera and the film, which came in little packs that were just as expensive as the camera itself. Most families did not mess with that. Too pricey, too fragile, too much of a risk. But for the kids who had one, it was a golden ticket to popularity. At birthday parties, school trips, sleepovers, you knew who had the camera. They would pass the picture around as it faded into life. Everyone would huddle around like it was a crystal ball. And even if the photo came out blurry, it still felt special. Because you could hold it. You could pin it to a wall or tuck it into a notebook. It was proof that you were there. That moment belonged to you. Unless, of course, you were just standing on the edge of the photo, half in, half forgotten. If you saw one of these leaning against a kid's garage, you knew they were living a different life. The Sears 10-speed Free Spirit was not just a bicycle, it was an upgrade. Taller, sleeker, and built for long rides, this thing looked like it came with a training manual. And unlike your single-speed hand-me-down, this had gears, 10 of them. That meant you could coast up hills while everyone else was walking theirs to the top. But bikes like this did not come cheap. They were department store royalty. Rich kids got them for birthdays, milestones, or just because. The paint never chipped, the chain never squeaked, and the kid riding it always looked like they had somewhere important to be, even if they were just circling the cul-de-sac. And when they pulled up to school, they parked them like prized possessions. You did not dare lean your bike next to theirs. It just looked wrong. These bikes were made for smooth roads, summer wind, and families who had extra room in the garage. You could hear the click of the shifters from a mile away, and every click reminded you that some kids were already going places, even if it was just around the block. The Light-Brite itself was already a showstopper. Plug it in, stick colored pegs into a black screen, and watch your artwork light up. But here is the kicker. Most kids only had the basic set. Rich kids had the extra refill packs. That meant more templates, more colors, more options. Unicorns, rocket ships, zoo animals, you name it. The refill packs were not cheap. You had to buy them separately, and once they were used, that was it. No do-overs. They had enough pegs to make a Light-Brite zoo, a Light-Brite city, a Light-Brite universe. Their templates were rotated weekly, like gallery installations. Meanwhile, your set still had 2 missing red pegs and a sun that was mostly blue. So most of us rationed them like gold. 1 template per month maybe. But if your family had money, you went through them like printer paper. You would visit a friend's house and see 10 finished Light-Brite templates pinned to their bedroom wall, full gallery mode. And meanwhile, yours still had that same flower pattern you made 6 months ago. But even if you did not have the extras, you still loved the idea. There was something special about watching your design light up in the dark, even if it was the same one every time. This one was straight up ridiculous, in the best way possible. A miniature pool table, complete with Nerf cue sticks, soft balls, and felt surface. It was like a toy, a game, and furniture all rolled into one. But you needed space. A lot of it. You could not just throw this on the floor and start playing. It took over the basement or a rec room, which meant the kid who had one also had a basement or a rec room. These sets were not cheap either. They came in big boxes and assembling them took time. But when they were set up, they were the crown jewel of the playroom. They were not built for bedrooms or cramped living rooms. They were built for homes with finished basements and quiet carpeted spaces where parents let you leave stuff out. You knew a kid had money when they had rooms dedicated to fun. You could hear the balls clack gently as rich kids lined up their shots like little pros. They wore smug grins while you tried to figure out how to hold the Nerf stick without snapping it. And the worst part? They were not even that into it. They would play a few rounds, get bored, and move on. Meanwhile, you were over there dreaming of owning one for real. Because in a world where everything felt temporary, a pool table, even a Nerf one, felt like luxury you could keep. These things were loud, literally and figuratively. Custom name belt buckles became a full-blown trend in the 1970s, and if your name was shining in metal across your waist, you were automatically cooler. They were chunky, shiny, and spelled out exactly who you were. And trust me, only certain kids wore them. The ones whose parents took them to the mall and said, "Pick anything you want." These buckles were not just about fashion, they were about identity. In a time before social media, this was your personal brand, worn right at the center of your body. You would walk into school and bam, there it was. Tony, Michelle, Jason, like a name tag that you had to earn. It said, "I matter." It said, "Look at me." And more than anything, it said, "I am not afraid to shine." Most of us could not afford them. Maybe you had a plain belt. Maybe you had no belt at all. But the kids with custom buckles, they made sure you saw them. They would tug their shirts up just enough, stand with hands on hips, or lean against lockers so that metal gleamed in the hallway light. It was all for show, and it worked. These were not just toys. They were explosions with permission slips. Model rocket launch sets in the 1970s were the holy grail of cool. You got a tube, some fins, a nose cone, and most importantly, a real engine. You could build it, paint it, and watch it launch hundreds of feet into the sky. But they were not cheap, and they were not sold just anywhere. You needed adult supervision, wide open spaces, and money for replacement engines. That meant most kids never got to launch one. Rich kids, though, they had the whole setup. They would bring them to school science fairs or launch them at the park on weekends with their parents filming from the sidelines. You could hear the countdown and your heart would pound, even if it was not your rocket. It was the kind of moment you would remember for the rest of your life, just watching. The blast-off made you feel like something bigger was always just out of reach. The rest of us just stood back, hoping to feel the whoosh as it lifted off. And when that rocket cracked through the clouds and left a trail of smoke behind, it felt like freedom, like possibility, like everything you wanted but could not quite reach. It was not just a toy. It was a whole world, scaled down to fit on the carpet. The Fisher-Price Play Family House came with a folding design that clicked open like a suitcase full of stories. You had the little plastic people, the tiny blue car, the staircase that doubled as a carrying handle, and of course, the garage. That little garage door rolled up and down with a satisfying snap, like you were living in miniature suburbia. And that is exactly what it was. The dream of a cozy home, shrunk down for small hands and big imaginations. But make no mistake, this set was premium. It was more than just the house. There were versions that came with extra cars, furniture, pets, even a plastic fence to circle the yard. And each one cost a little more. Rich kids had the full lineup. Their playroom was like a neighborhood. You would visit and see a fire station, a schoolhouse, and the house with the garage, all perfectly arranged. You wanted to dive in, but it always felt like you were borrowing someone else's world. The Play Family House was about more than pretend. It was about stability, warmth, and a sense that everything had its place. The beds were always made. The fridge was always full. There were no broken windows or peeling paint. You did not just play house. You imagined what it felt like to live in one that never ran out of light. The regular Lincoln logs were already something special. Those smooth, notched pieces of wood that clicked together into cabins and forts, every kid loved them. But the giant Frontier set? That was a whole different league. This thing came in a massive box, filled to the brim with hundreds of logs, roofs, chimneys, and all the accessories needed to build your own village. Not just a cabin, a settlement. And rich kids had them all. They would dump the whole set onto their clean playroom floor and start building like pioneers with a trust fund. The rest of us maybe had a small tin with a dozen pieces that barely made a fence. But the giant Frontier set? You could make entire battle scenes. It had extra long logs, green roof slats, plastic figures, even little horses and wagons. These were not just toys. They were a historical reenactment in your living room. The box said, ages 4 and up. But you needed a good 15 feet of floor space just to use the whole set properly. Rich kids would invite you over, let you build one wall, then take over. It was always their fort, their rules. And even though you told yourself it was just wood, it still felt like they had more imagination just because they could build more. That is what these sets did. They made creativity feel like something you had to buy in bulk. Lunch was supposed to be a break, but in the 1970s it was also a fashion show. And the kids who had designer lunchboxes, metal ones with full-color prints of superheroes, cartoons, or pop icons, walked into the cafeteria like royalty. Marvel Comics, Star Wars, The Bionic Woman, Dukes of Hazzard, whatever was hot at the time, it showed up in metal form with a matching thermos inside. Some kids just had paper bags or plain boxes with names written in marker. But the rich kids, they had style. They had that satisfying metal clack when the lid snapped shut. They had clean interiors, never rusted or dented. The thermos always fit perfectly in the lid ring, no leaks, no broken caps. Their sandwiches came out looking like magazine ads. Meanwhile, your soggy peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper was probably mashed under an apple and a warm juice box. Even opening their lunchbox was a moment. It flipped open to reveal perfect compartments, sometimes with notes from mom or shiny napkins that looked brand new. That lunchbox said more about their life than any report card could. It said, "We shop at the big store. We care about presentation. We do not reuse bags until they rip." You were eating the same food, sure, but somehow it always tasted different when it came out of a bag that used to hold groceries. They were kits, but they felt like blueprints for the future. Those Radio Shack electronics kits came with tiny wires, bulbs, resistors, batteries, and a little booklet full of instructions that read like a spy manual. You could make radios, alarms, light sensors, even a lie detector if you wired it right. But it was not just about the builds. It was about who got to build them. These kits were not cheap. You needed a parent who would drive you to a Radio Shack, who would pay for something educational and expensive, and who trusted you not to burn the house down. Rich kids got those kits for Christmas, then spent winter break building circuits in their bedrooms. They had the table space, they had the batteries, they had the confidence. Most of us were still figuring out how to hook up a flashlight bulb without it shorting out. These kits made you feel like an inventor. They sparked ideas you did not even know you had. But more than anything, they whispered a message. You are smart enough to make something work. Unless, of course, you never had the chance to try. That is what stuck. Not the blinking light or the faint sound of static from a crystal radio. It was the thought that maybe, with the right wires and a little help, you could have done something amazing too. Yes, you heard that right. A Tiffany & Company sterling silver baby spoon. Not a toy, not a gadget, a spoon, and it said everything you needed to know about someone's family. These spoons were engraved, monogrammed, and tucked inside powder blue boxes with silk lining. They were gifts for babies born into money, displayed like trophies on a shelf or saved for when company came over. You were not meant to use them for cereal. They were more about legacy than lunch. Rich kids had them before they could even hold a fork. You would hear about it casually. Oh, that's my spoon from Tiffany's, like it was the most normal sentence in the world. Meanwhile, you were lucky if your spoon did not bend in the dishwasher. This was luxury at its quietest. A symbol not meant to impress you, but to remind you who already had it all. Because if your first utensil came from a jewelry store, you were not just ahead in life. You were practically born at the finish line. And while you were peeling off stickers from dollar store silverware, they were polishing something engraved with their initials. It was a spoon, sure, but it might as well have been a crown. Backyard fun in the 1970s was loud, chaotic, and often a little dangerous. Enter the water wiggle. It looked innocent enough. A smiling plastic head connected to a long hose. But the moment the water was turned on, it became a wild, whipping, serpentine menace. It sprayed water in every direction and flailed unpredictably, turning the yard into a circus of screams and soaked clothes. Kids chased it. It chased them back. You never knew where it would go. One second it was dancing in the air. The next it was smacking you in the shins. It had one job: to create watery mayhem, and it was great at it. Parents watched from porches, laughing or nervously sipping iced tea. Some turned the pressure down. Others cranked it up. Either way, you ended up drenched. There were no safety labels or slow modes, just you, the hose, and the wiggling chaos that could knock over toddlers and send dogs running. It was thrilling, it was unpredictable, and it was absolutely beloved. They do not make toys like that anymore, probably for good reason. But those summer afternoons when laughter mixed with shrieks and the sprinkler twisted through the air like a possessed noodle, those are hard to forget. Corgi toys were more than just cars. They were miniature masterpieces. Introduced by British company Metoy in the late 1950s, they reached peak popularity in the 1960s with American kids who were obsessed with anything fast, shiny, or connected to TV and movie heroes. These die-cast vehicles were small enough to fit in your pocket, but detailed enough to spark hours of imaginative play. Police cars came with real-looking sirens. Race cars had working hoods. And the crown jewel? The James Bond Aston Martin DB5, complete with ejector seat, pop-out machine guns, and a hidden bulletproof shield. For kids growing up in the 1960s, it was the coolest thing you could own. Movie magic shrunk down and placed in your palm. Corgi cars raced across kitchen floors, crashed down backyard driveways, and survived countless shoebox battles. They felt heavier than Hot Wheels, sturdier than Matchbox, and somehow more real. Over time, most got scratched, dented, or lost. But finding one today, even chipped, brings back the joy of flipping it over to read the brand stamp and revving it across a table edge. They were not just toys. They were little slices of the world, only faster. Only in the 1970s could a rock become a celebrity. The pet rock craze of 1975 was so absurd it made sense. For just under $4, you could buy a smooth gray stone nestled in a cardboard box with breathing holes and a care manual. It had no eyes, no mouth, no tricks, and kids adored it. Why? Maybe because it was funny, maybe because it was simple, or maybe, deep down, it was because even the most ordinary thing could feel special with enough imagination. Children gave their pet rocks names, personalities, backstories. They were carried in pockets, introduced to friends, given beds made from shoeboxes. Some kids genuinely believed their rock understood them. It never talked back. It never judged. It just was. And in a world of flashing toys and plastic noise, the pet rock was oddly peaceful. A quiet rebellion against doing too much, against always needing more. It reminded kids that anything could be a toy if you loved it enough. The pet rock was not a gimmick. It was a mirror. It showed how much kids could create out of nothing. And somehow, that silly little stone became one of the most unforgettable fads in history. Before streaming, before boomboxes, there was the handheld AM transistor radio. It fit in your palm, had a tiny metal antenna, and brought the world to your ears one scratchy signal at a time. You turned a dial hoping for a station that came in clear. Sometimes music, sometimes baseball, sometimes late-night talk that made you feel like an adult. The static was constant, the sound was tinny, but the magic was undeniable. You could carry it anywhere. Into the backyard, under the covers, on long car rides. It was your secret channel to everything that mattered. Some had fake wood paneling. Others were neon or chrome. You might remember using a single earbud, just one, while your parents talked nearby. That little radio was a lifeline to top 40 hits, to the ball game score, to stories told in the dark, and you treated it like treasure. Batteries died fast, but you always had spares. You knew the stations by heart, and even when the sound cut out, you waited, hoping it would come back. That simple, static-filled box gave you a sense of independence. You were connected to something bigger. Even if all you got was weather and warnings, it still felt like power. Fondue parties were peak 1960s sophistication, cheesy, communal, and irresistibly fun. Imported from Switzerland and embraced by American hostesses everywhere, fondue turned dinner into an event. Friends gathered around bubbling pots of melted Gruyere or Emmental, long forks in hand, dipping cubes of crusty bread into molten gold. It was interactive, slightly exotic, and made conversation flow almost as much as the wine. The fondue pot itself became a household item, sleek, colorful, often gifted at weddings. There were rules. Do not drop your bread in the pot, stir in a figure eight, and keep the cheese smooth. Some added white wine or garlic, others experimented with chocolate fondue for dessert. Either way, the evening was about more than food. It was about sharing, laughing, and leaning in, literally and socially. In an era that embraced kitsch and community, fondue was a perfect fit. It brought people together in a circle, turned dinner into performance, and gave every guest a role to play. Long before tapas or charcuterie boards, fondue was the original shareable meal. For those who remember the scent of wine and cheese wafting through a mid-century living room, it was a flavor and feeling that defined the times. Micronauts were not household names like G.I. Joe or Star Wars toys, but for the kids who loved them, they were everything. Small, strange, and endlessly customizable, Micronauts were the science fiction building blocks of your imagination. Released in the late 1970s, they came with magnetic limbs, clear plastic torsos, interchangeable armor, and ships you could take apart and reconfigure 100 different ways. There was no show at first, no comic book, just you and your mind filling in the gaps. What planet did they come from? What powers did they have? It did not matter. You decided. The Micronauts were yours. One day they were heroes, the next they were villains. Their limbs could pop off. Their vehicles turned into bases, walkers, or weapons. They were not just action figures. They were tools for storytelling. And every kid who had a handful knew the thrill of inventing whole galaxies on the living room floor. While other toys had scripts, Micronauts had potential. They invited you to build the adventure, not just follow it. They were futuristic, weird, and wild, and that made them unforgettable. In a time before everything came with instructions, Micronauts handed you the pieces and whispered, "Go create." Before the sleek inline skates of the 1990s, there were the clunky, lovable roller skates with metal wheels. They strapped over your shoes with thick leather buckles and screeched across every surface like they were mad at the floor. If you skated indoors, you sounded like a marching band. If you braved the sidewalk, every crack was a threat. But none of that mattered. Because once you got going, it was freedom. You were flying, wobbling, yes, but flying. These skates had no padding, no ankle support, and no mercy. But they came with memories, rolling through driveways, circling the garage, racing your siblings until someone wiped out. You remember the sound they made on concrete, the clatter as you tried to stop, the feeling of falling and getting back up anyway. Roller discos made them iconic. Kids and teens glided under colored lights, surrounded by Bee Gees and Donna Summer, feeling cooler than they ever had. You might have never mastered the spin. You probably fell more than you want to admit. But those skates, those metal-wheeled monstrosities, were the soundtrack to a whole chapter of growing up. They were heavy, loud, and impossible to forget. Twister was the game that got people off the couch and tangled in each other's limbs. Released in 1966, it came with a plastic mat covered in colored circles and a spinner that decided your next move. Left hand red, right foot green. Before you knew it, you were stretching across the mat in a precarious pose, face pressed against someone's knee, hoping no one slipped. It was silly, physical, and weirdly intimate. Some parents called it indecent. Some schools banned it. But kids loved it. So did teenagers. It broke the ice at parties, sparked laughter between siblings, and gave families something active to do together. It was as much about falling over as it was about winning. The rustle of the mat, the sound of giggles as someone toppled, the concentration in trying to stay upright, it was all part of the fun. Twister took no prep and delivered instant chaos. It did not care about strategy. It cared about balance, luck, and how far you could stretch without collapsing. And for many, it was the first time a game made you move, laugh, and fall down all in one messy, unforgettable moment. The Easy Bake Oven was not a toy. It was a rite of passage, a small, pastel-colored appliance that turned powdered mix into warm, edible cake using nothing but a light bulb. And somehow, that tiny miracle made you feel like a real chef. It was introduced earlier, but by the 1970s, every kid wanted one. Boys, girls, it did not matter. The Easy Bake Oven was your ticket to independence. You measured, you mixed, you waited. That soft hum of the bulb heating up your mini metal pan was suspense in its purest form. Would it bake right? Would it burn? Would Mom let you make another? The cakes were not good. They were dry, crumbly, and oddly sweet. But no one cared, because they were yours. You did not help Mom. You did not watch someone else. You baked it. That mattered. It was messy. It was thrilling. It was a small slice of adulthood you could claim all for yourself. And every time you opened that tiny oven door and pulled out a crooked, half-baked cupcake, you were not just making dessert. You were making memories. You were learning to take pride in the process, even when the result was barely edible. If you remember clacker toys, you probably also remember getting smacked in the face. These were two solid acrylic balls connected by a string, meant to be swung up and down until they clacked together above and below your hand. That was the whole toy. No batteries, no screen. Just two hard spheres ready to leave a bruise. And kids loved them. The louder and faster they clacked, the cooler you were. It was a skill to master. Get the rhythm right, and you could keep them going for minutes. Get it wrong, and you got a nasty surprise. Parents hated them. Teachers banned them. Hospitals probably kept a few on hand just to demonstrate what not to do. They were loud, dangerous, and oddly satisfying. For a few wild years, clackers were everywhere, on sidewalks, in classrooms, and hidden under beds when they got taken away. Eventually, safety concerns shut them down, but not before a generation got their fill of noise and near misses. They were outlawed in some places, but that only made them cooler. If you ever got them moving just right, you remember the thrill, and maybe a headache to go with it. They were chaos in toy form, and we would not have had it any other way. Operation was not just a game, it was a test of nerves. Released by Milton Bradley in 1965, this battery-operated board game turned you into a surgeon, operating on a cartoonish patient named Cavity Sam. He lay there in his hospital gown, wide-eyed and helpless, with little cavities holding ailments like a funny bone, a wishbone, or a Charlie horse. The goal? Use tweezers to remove each piece without touching the metal edges of the cavity. If you slipped even slightly, the board buzzed loudly and Sam's red nose lit up. That buzz? It haunted dreams. Kids would wince, laugh, and shout all at once. The challenge was as much about steady hands as it was about keeping calm under pressure. Operation was competitive, silly, and oddly tense. You might remember tilting the board to cheat or holding your breath during a particularly tricky extraction. It was often pulled out during family game night, and even adults found themselves sweating over the tiny butterfly in the stomach. Operation was more than a toy. It was an experience, a rite of passage, and the first time many kids learned that success sometimes comes down to keeping a steady hand. Barbie in the 1970s was more than plastic. She was a portal, a way to imagine what life could look like if the world were just a little more pink, a little more perfect. Kids did not just play with Barbie, they lived with her. She had outfits for every occasion. Dream houses with elevators, cars with glittering wheels. She could be a doctor, an astronaut, a fashion model, a veterinarian, all before you had even picked a major. Her world was one where nothing felt too big to dream. And for a generation of girls, and more than a few boys, Barbie was proof that you could be glamorous and powerful at the same time. You could give her stories, drama, triumph, romance, heartbreak. You could change her hair, swap her clothes, reinvent her life in one afternoon. Barbie taught kids to narrate, to imagine, to believe that reinvention was normal. And even when her legs got loose or her hair went frizzy, you still loved her, because she had been there. She had danced across your carpet, ridden in your bike basket, and laid beside you on nights you were too afraid to sleep alone. Barbie was never just a doll. She was you, just with a better wardrobe. Suddenly turned red, white, and blue. The United States Bicentennial was not just a celebration, it was a full-on marketing explosion. You could not walk through a store without seeing patriotic plates, mugs, coins, or even shampoo bottles branded with stars and stripes. It was not just about pride, it was about collecting. From quarters stamped with a drummer boy to commemorative soda cans and decorative tins, Americans scooped up anything that screamed 1776 to 1976. Kids got coloring books with bald eagles. Adults hung commemorative plates on the wall and bought matching sets of Liberty Bell glasses from the gas station. You might remember paperweights, lunchboxes, and even cereal boxes that joined in. For one shining year, everything in your house looked like it belonged to George Washington's birthday party. And while some saw it as kitschy or overdone, others cherished these pieces. They were physical reminders of a once-in-a-lifetime celebration. Even today, if you find one buried in a drawer or tucked in a box, it hits differently. Not just patriotic, but personal. Because in that moment, the whole country was decorating its memory, and every family had at least one artifact to prove they were part of it. Tang was not just a drink, it was an icon of American space-age optimism. Though developed in 1957, it exploded into fame in the 1960s when NASA used it during Project Mercury and Gemini missions. Suddenly, drinking Tang meant more than just orange-flavored powder. It meant drinking like an astronaut. Kids begged their parents for it. Commercials showed bright pictures on sunny breakfast tables with the promise of vitamins and space-fueled energy. It came in a foil pouch dissolved into water with a quick stir and tasted like the future. The orange flavor was tangy, a little artificial, but full of excitement. Parents loved it for the no-mess prep and long shelf life. Children loved it because it made them feel connected to the cosmos. No one cared that it was mostly sugar and flavoring. Tang had a mission patch of approval. It became a staple in American pantries, always ready for a quick mix on a busy morning. By the end of the decade, it had grown into more than a drink. It was a symbol, a bright orange badge of the space race, proudly poured into plastic cups across the country. And for many, one sip still tastes like childhood and liftoff. There was something sacred about turning off the lights and flipping on a Light-Brite. Suddenly, your bedroom transformed into a tiny, glowing studio. With each colored peg you pressed into the black screen, magic happened. Reds, blues, greens, and yellows lit up like little fireworks trapped in plastic. Introduced in the late 1960s but beloved through the 1970s, Light-Brite was not loud. It did not move or speak, but it taught kids something powerful: how to make beauty, one dot at a time. You started with a blank template or maybe a paper guide with letters, but over time, you stopped using instructions. You made your own stars, your own hearts, your own masterpieces. It was slow, patient, personal. The warmth of the bulb inside hummed beneath your fingers. You could feel the light, not just see it. Sometimes you messed up, pulled out the wrong peg. It did not matter. You just kept building, fixing, creating, and when you finally stepped back and saw your little glowing creation, it felt like pride. Not toy pride, real pride, because you did that. Light-Brite made every child an artist, and in a world of noise and chaos, it offered a quiet glow of control, creativity, and calm. Know the struggle. These were not the soft plastic kind you could twist. These were cold, clanky, and had a metal lever down the center that always seemed to jam. You filled them carefully, making sure not to spill as you walked them to the freezer. And when you wanted ice, you braced yourself. That lever took strength and guts. Pull it too fast, and ice shards sprayed across the kitchen. Pull it too slow, and it did nothing. There was a sweet spot, and only adults seemed to know it. Sometimes the cube stuck anyway. Sometimes the tray froze shut. And yet, there was something satisfying about the ritual. You felt like you were unlocking a frozen treasure. The sound of the lever cracking through the ice was loud, sharp, and kind of thrilling. Ice cubes never tasted better than when they were earned. Those trays lived in every freezer drawer, slowly rusting, denting, but always doing their job. Replaced now by automatic makers and silicone trays, they are largely forgotten. But for anyone who remembers the clang of metal and the cold burn of the handle, they are a badge of domestic toughness. Saturday morning was a sacred ritual. You rolled out of bed in your pajamas, shuffled to the kitchen, and poured your... Bugles arrived in 1966, and with them came a whole new shape of snacking. Shaped like tiny trumpets or cones, they were the snack you could eat or wear. Kids popped them onto their fingertips, wiggled their hands like claws, and then crunched them down one by one. But the novelty was not just in the shape. Bugles had a distinct texture, light, crispy, and a little flaky, that made them feel different from chips or pretzels. The corn-based flavor was salty, a little buttery, and oddly addictive. Unlike many snacks of the era, Bugles were not trying to copy something else. They were their own thing. Whether poured into a bowl for a party or packed into a lunchbox for recess, they brought a certain crunchy cheer to any setting. Parents liked that they were baked, not fried. Kids just liked that they were fun. Bugles became a staple of 1960s snack shelves alongside pretzel rods and Fritos, but they stood out for their playfulness. Even now, decades later, slipping a Bugle onto your finger sparks a flash of childhood. They were silly, satisfying, and one of the few snacks that doubled as a costume. Sesame Street was not just a television show. It was the first place where kids saw their world reflected back in bright colors and warm voices. Premiering in 1969 but defining childhood through the 1970s, it took learning and made it joyful, silly, and deeply human. The show blended puppets with real people, laughter with lessons, and music with meaning. Where else could you find a giant yellow bird, a grumpy green trash can dweller, and a count who taught you math by laughing? For kids growing up in uncertain times, Sesame Street was a steady friend. It taught numbers and letters, sure, but it also taught kindness, empathy, and how to exist in a world full of different faces and feelings. It was playful, but it never talked down to you. It made you feel smart, capable, seen. And in a world where grown-ups often brushed kids aside, Sesame Street looked you in the eyes and said, "You matter." It made television personal. It turned characters like Elmo, Cookie Monster, and Grover into lifelong companions. And it was not afraid to get serious, talking about loss, identity, and family in ways that stuck. For an entire generation, learning started not in school, but on a stoop at 123 Sesame Street. Before Bluetooth speakers and streaming playlists, there was the Fisher-Price record player, and it was a masterpiece of childhood simplicity. You wound it up with a chunky white knob and placed a thick plastic disc on the turntable. It clicked into place, and when the needle dropped, the magic began. Out came twinkly, music box-style versions of nursery rhymes, folk songs, and lullabies. The songs were short, cheerful, and unforgettable. The discs were colorful and clunky, with molded ridges that somehow produced melodies. It did not matter if the sound was a little warped or off-key. You were in control. You had your own music machine. For many kids, this was their first experience playing music, and the pride that came with it was unmatched. You could stack your favorite discs. You could play the same one on repeat until it drove your parents up the wall. And the best part? No batteries. Just your hands, your ears, and your imagination. You did not need to understand how it worked. You just needed to hear that familiar click, feel the turn of the crank, and know that something sweet was about to happen. It was low-tech joy in a beige plastic box, and it never stopped playing in our heads. Metal ice cube trays were cold, clunky, and unforgettable. Before plastic trays and automatic ice makers took over, these heavy-duty aluminum trays were the standard in American freezers during the 1960s. They had a removable divider with a metal lever that cracked the cubes free with a satisfying snap. But it was not always smooth. The handle sometimes stuck, the cubes often splintered, and if your hands were wet or too warm, the metal could stick to your fingers, something you only did once. Despite the fuss, there was something almost ceremonial about making ice. You filled the tray carefully, slid it into the freezer with steady hands, and waited. Hours later, you lifted the lever, twisted the tray, and heard that sharp mechanical crack as the cubes broke loose. It was noisy, it was physical, and it was reliable. Drinks were never the same without it. Whether you were filling a glass of Tang, cooling a cola, or preparing a highball for company, those chunky, slightly imperfect cubes were part of the experience. Today's ice makers are quiet and effortless, but they lack the charm and the muscle memory of prying open one of those stubborn metal trays. For many, it is a sound and struggle that still lives in the back of the mind. If Sesame Street was your preschool best friend, the Electric Company was your cool older sibling. Airing in the 1970s, it was wild, fast-paced, and just a little bit chaotic in the best way. It taught reading through sketches, songs, animations, and goofy superheroes who shouted phonics like they were battle cries. It was loud, it was weird, and it was impossible to forget. With a cast that included Morgan Freeman and Rita Moreno, the Electric Company did not talk down to kids, it pulled them up. It made reading feel like something urgent, something fun, something that could change the world. You did not just sit back and watch, you joined in. You sounded out words with them. You felt like part of the team. It blurred the line between learning and entertainment. It showed that intelligence and humor were not opposites. They were partners. And for kids who felt bored or left behind in school, the Electric Company gave them a way in. a way to laugh and learn at the same time. It was messy and magical, full of wordplay and wonder, and it proved that even the alphabet could be electric. Felt seen or slighted? Drop a comment, tap like, and subscribe for more memories you missed out on.